The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. The Fall of the House of Usher was first published in 1839 in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. The following year, it was collected into a 2-volume book of Poe's work that included stories and poetry called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Poe was the first American writer to attempt to support himself and his family through literary pursuits, by writing, by editing, and by publishing magazines. But even in the late 1830s, as this collection in 2 volumes was moving toward publication, Poe was working to solidify his name in American letters. To help promote the book, in October of 1839 he wrote author Washington Irving in the hopes that Irving would offer praise that would help sell copies. He enclosed a recent copy of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, which included another of his stories along with a letter that read in part, quote, "If I could be permitted to add even a word or two from yourself, my fortune would be made. I do not say this unadvisedly, for I am deliberately convinced that your good opinion, thus permitted to be expressed, would ensure me that public attention which would carry me on to fortune hereafter, by ensuing me fame at once." Irving responded with a few lines of praise, describing Poe's work as having a, quote, "highly picturesque style," and saying of one story that, quote, "the singular and mysterious interest is well sustained throughout." The quote, or in the language of the publishing business, the blurb, was featured in the book when it was published. But with a small audience for fiction in America in 1840, Poe found that this book in 2 volumes brought him more notoriety rather than money. Notoriety, of course, helped Poe find further work as an editor for magazines. Also, it offered him access to other important American writers. But in terms of payment, Poe wasn't offered royalties for the books published in 1840. Rather, he was offered 20 copies of the 2-volume set as full payment. There are a number of elements that readers of romantic fiction will find familiar in the opening to The Fall of the House of Usher. This story, like Rip Van Winkle and Young Goodman Brown, presents a lone character who has left the city and has ventured out into the wilderness. Similarly, in terms of national placement of the story, Poe creates hybrid fiction. Whereas Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle place the European tale into an American setting, Poe's approach is the exact opposite. He is placing his American imagination into a European setting. This story, with its generations-old mansion, is clearly placed in Eastern Europe. Poe would place other stories in Europe as well, such as The Cask of Amontillado, which was set in Italy. Poe himself had very little first-hand information about life in Europe. When he was a child, his adopted family, the Allens, took him to England, where he attended elementary school, but he returned to America when he was 11. The details of place he presents in his story appear to be largely drawn from travelogues he had read and conversations he had had with other travelers. As an adult, Poe rarely has surplus income. Even when his adopted father, John Allen, dies, Poe is left nothing. As this story opens, we find that an unnamed protagonist is moving through the woods after receiving a somewhat vague letter from his childhood friend Roderick Usher. According to the narrator, quote, "Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him which in its wildly inopportune nature had admitted of no other than a personal reply." The manuscript gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. In this passage, the phrase boon companion essentially means best friend, but we will find out later in the story the narrator isn't Roderick's best friend. It's true they were friends. The narrator, however, is a different kind of friend. Every fraternity house, I believe, has one person like this. The narrator is the friend who will do whatever is asked without asking any questions whatsoever. The narrator is also the character who sees everything and remembers it quite clearly, but understands absolutely nothing. And that is why Roderick is calling for him. But before we begin to explore the narrator's identity, let's take a look at the beginning of the story as a tone or image poem. Poe's strategy here is to employ the details and language of poetry so that every part of the story, even the sound of language, is aimed at creating a specific emotional effect in readers, in this case one of dread and foreboding. Here's how the story opens. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within the view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul for which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. The early section of this story also gives us a few important pieces of information about the Usher family and the family home. The first piece of information concerns the rise and fall of the Usher family over centuries. Quote, I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time-honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variations, so lain. To put this another way, at one point, many generations ago, the Usher family had expanded towards social prominence and wealth with some children and prosperous businesses. But over time, that prosperousness and the breadth of the family relations had fallen away, leaving only Roderick and his sister Madeline as the last of the Usher family. Likewise, the narrator observes that the house, too, like the family, has moved into a period of decay. From the mainland, he can see clearly the large family house on an island surrounded by a tarn. A tarn is a body of water, such as a pond or a lake. And from his vantage point, he can see how a substantial crack is already working its way down through the house. Quote, perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in the front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. And with this, the narrator suggests that these two elements are connected, that the decay in the family line has produced decay in the family house. In fact, in the area, the phrase the House of Usher had two meanings. It could refer to the physical mansion, or it could refer to the family, which was now down just to the brother and sister. As we will soon see, both versions of the House of Usher are in deep decay as we move into the story. As I mentioned earlier, this story was published in 1839, and to unlock the story, we need a little literary information about the period in which the story was written. Poe isn't being coy or trying to trick us, nor does he intend for his original readers in 1839 to attend a class to figure out how this story works. But the cultural cues of 1839 are simply not the cultural cues that we have in books and films today. For example, you know some really odd and totally random cultural cues. Let's say as a class, we go to the movies. It's a beach picture, and 15 minutes into the picture, There's a sequence in which a person is swimming by herself just beyond the breakwater. The sun is low in the sky, and then the camera moves down toward the waterline, swaying a little, so that all of us in the audience feel like we're in the ocean too. And then comes two ascending notes played on an upright bass. And you know what that means, right? Yeah, though we haven't seen it yet and the girl in the water isn't aware of it. It means a shark is circling the depths below her. And that is the most totally random thing, yet we all understand the auditory connection. So do you think that if in 150 or 200 years, if we as a class watch the exact same movie when they arrive at the swimming scene with do you think that everyone in the distant future will understand that equals shark? Yeah, probably not. Well, we need a similar key to unlock the House of Usher. It's not that Poe was trying to be tricky or secretive. It's just that the cultural cues common in Poe's time aren't as common now. In Poe's time, vampires and vampire lore were common elements of popular culture. In terms of a timeline, in 1839, when this story is published, we aren't yet up to the point where Bram Stoker would publish Dracula, which is probably the most famous vampire story published in that century. But there were plenty of other vampires in fiction and poems, including John Pilati's story, The Vampire, essentially a short novel published in 1819, which was later made into a stage play that was so popular that it spawned an unauthorized sequel. And after that, other vampire stories were soon penned. The Fall of the House of Usher is a story over which readers have debated its ultimate meaning for decades. But that, I think, is the point. Remember, our narrator sees everything but understands nothing, which means that us readers are asked to assemble these clues until we understand the secret story inside of the House of Usher. And that is a far more complex understanding of the relationship between reader and text than anything we've seen up until this time. In stories by Hawthorne or Irving, the meaning is spelled out in the language itself. Here, the details are laid out in such a way that the reader must connect them to produce a meaning that, for them, best explains the story. To put this another way, the details suggest the meaning, or rather, meanings, and the reader completes the process through analysis like a detective. I've mentioned elsewhere that often in the early part of the 1800s, stories were read aloud, in part because of the scarcity of books, and in part because of a lower level of literacy. You can imagine a family or a group of friends sitting around a fire at night as one person reads this story aloud, and then all of the listeners at the end put forward their best theories as to the ultimate mystery of the House of Usher. And that is a far more sophisticated understanding of how readers might engage the materials of fiction than anything we've seen up until this point. So the vampire story is not the only way to assemble these details, but suggestions of a vampire story are heavily laid into this text in such a way as to guide readers towards suspecting that possibly a vampire lurks in the house and that our clueless narrator might be in great jeopardy because even though he sees all of these clues, he has no idea what they mean. And so where are the clues that suggest that this might be a vampire story? Well, they're all over the place, and once I start pointing them out, I think you might be surprised at how many there are. I'll look at some individual passages from the story in order of their appearance. This is shortly after our unnamed narrator arrives at the Usher mansion. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The great furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. So what is the first thing that he notices in this set when he walks into the house? Well, it's these dark draperies that hang over the windows. It's as though he walks in and says, "Hey, Usher, good to see you. I like what you've done with the place. Yeah, blackout blinds, keeps out all the sun. Yeah, just like in the Holiday Inn." And then a little bit later, he has another list of observations about Usher and the place where he lives. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at times remarkable, a cadaverousness of complexion. Let me just pause there for a second. What does that phrase mean, a cadaverousness of complexion? It's as though our narrator is saying, essentially, "Hey, Usher, you look like a dead person, like a cadaver." And then continuing from there. An eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and a very pallid, but a surprisingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. Let me pause there for a second. So what's happening here? So in Poe's time, in the 1830s, part of vampire lore that he would have been familiar with is that vampires had a strong sexual vitality to them. People of both genders found them very attractive. There were stories in Poe's days of pairings between men and women vampires and men and women vampires. So it crossed over gender lines in terms of how they were perceived. And that's exactly what's happening here. And this list of Usher's attractive features continues a little later on in the same paragraph. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things, startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as in its wild gossamer texture it floated rather than fell about the face. And so here we have those two elements again juxtaposed. The sexual lure of Usher, possibly as our vampire, and then also the ghastly pallor of his skin. He again looks dead, as though there's no blood moving inside of his body. A little bit later, he suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could only wear garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light. And so here, in case you didn't get the first reference to the blackout blinds, it's a little more straightforward. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light. But also in this, there's some other details that are again giving rise to vampire lore of Poe's times. So I know now we have a much better understanding of vampirism, and we know that the specific plant that causes vampires' offense is garlic. But back in Poe's time, they didn't have this advanced understanding of vampires like we do now. And so in this, maybe we see some of the early movements that will later lead to that part of vampire lore. It's the odors of all flowers that are oppressive. And then there's the suggestion that garments made of only fine fabrics, perhaps silk, are things that Usher is able to wear. A little bit later, we painted and read together, or I listened as if in a dream, to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. And so, just like today in the world of vampires, vampires are far more interested in the high arts as opposed to the popular arts. I assume that if you give a vampire a choice between going to a rock concert or going to a symphony, from what I've seen in films, they will almost always choose going to the symphony. The same is true in Poe's time. There's painting, there's reading, there's poetry, and there's this type of classical guitar. And so what is the speaking guitar? Well, the speaking guitar is the act of plucking out some chords, recites or perhaps invents some lines of poetry. And he does this a little later in the story with the song about his family's past. And here you can start to see that Usher is beginning to regret in some ways that he's called this friend out to him in his time of need. There's a specific task a little later in the story that this friend needs to help Usher accomplish. But there's other moments in the story where you can see Usher moving toward a confessional mood where he likely hopes that someone on the other side, his friend, might ask some probing questions so that Usher can relieve himself of whatever inner burdens he is carrying. But this is the friend that sees everything, understands nothing, and therefore asks no probing questions at all when Usher moves towards these confessional moments. One of these confessional moments is here in the song about his past. I'll read you some lines from the beginning and then some lines from the end. In the greatest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head in the monarch's thought dominion. It stood there, never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. And then in the stanzas that follow in the middle section, Usher relates how his family once expanded towards prosperousness, and then in the final stanzas that I will read, he talks about the bad things that have recently come. But evil things in robes. Let me just stop there for a second. Evil things in robes. We'll get more in a second, but evil things in robes is pretty much stock costuming from every 1930s vampire movie produced by Universal, and also stock costuming for pretty much every vampire story that Poe would have been familiar with in the 1830s. And so there's a visual suggestion here that allows us to frame the story more deeply in vampire lore. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate, and round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed, and travelers now within that valley through red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid ghastly river, through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh, but smile no more. So what exactly is Usher saying here? What is he trying to convey? Well, first of all, I think that he's putting out enough suggestions of the recent past so that anyone else other than our one particular narrator would follow this up with questions. Usher, what do you mean by smile no more? But our narrator's not going to have any follow-up questions whatsoever. But in these details, you can start to see the general framework that something supernatural has happened here. In a world before electricity, without supernatural powers, how would you create red-litten windows? And what are these vast forms that move fantastically? This speaks to the supernatural. And then at the end, everyone has left the Usher castle. They laugh, but they smile no more. And what does it sound like to laugh without a smile? Well, it sounds like pretty much every villain I've ever seen in a 007 movie. That evil laugh. I think that's what's being suggested there. And so there is a type of very dangerous play that's been engaged inside of this house. But our narrator, of course, never asks about it and leaves it to us readers to somehow put it all together. The next passage involves Usher's bedside reading. Our narrator sees everything and has a terrific memory, and so he notes down all of the things that Usher has been reading before bed, and it's a strange collection of books. All of the books are real except for the last one. The last book on the list is one that Poe has made up, and there's a problem with its title in Latin. Poe did take some classes in college. For a time, he went to the University of Virginia, but he left after accruing substantial gambling debts. Later, he attended West Point, but he left before finishing a degree. He has some exposure to Latin in school, but not as much as a person who in the early 1800s likely would have acquired by finishing a degree. Poe created the title for this book and then presumably translated it into Latin as well. You can get a loose sense of what Poe is after by the words he chooses, but the entire title doesn't translate smoothly back into English. When we get to that part of the list, I'll talk about a rough translation. Anyways, here is the passage. Our favorite volume was a small octavo edition of the Directorium Acquisitorium by the Dominican Imrich de Gaunt. This is a real book, a book of sorcery and witchcraft. The author describes various forbidden magical practices, including the baptism of images, conjuring spirits, evoking the names of angels and demons, and palm reading. And there were passages in the Pomponius Mela about old African satyrs and Egyptians over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. This is another real book written by an early Roman geographer that includes African satyrs. And what are satyrs? Well, these are creatures that are part human and part animal. I know now, after watching True Blood, that vampires have evolved in the last 150 or 200 years from creatures of the darkest night to creatures that now go out to bars and nightclubs and wear skinny jeans and button-downs. But in Poe's time, part of vampire lore is that these undead were part human, part bat, or part animal. And so maybe what's happening here is that Usher is contemplating how these other creatures that are part human and part animal might be like who he is, or what then he is becoming. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of an exceedingly rare and curious book in Quattro Gothic, The Manual of a Forgotten Church. Okay, and now we're coming up to the book that is exceedingly rare because Poe invents it. He gives it a title in Latin. The title he gives it is the Village Moratorium Secundum Crosium Ecclesiaste Magnitue. No book like this exists, and the title is made up, but bits of the title give you an idea of what Poe is after. So this is a book that is something like a church manual for people who Village Moratorium, which means roughly to wake up while dead. So this is a book for people who wake up as the undead. This whole time, our narrator puts down Usher's erratic actions to hypochondria. He thinks that it's in his head. But then we get to the high point of the story, when Lady Madeline supposedly dies. At this point in the story, Usher knows exactly what's going on. The Lady Madeline has a cataleptical disease, and so that means that during the day it's very difficult to wake her up. You lift up her arm and it falls right back down. You can't get her to rouse out of bed even if you shake her. Usher has used her condition to present her body as dead, though of course he knows she's still alive. What he needs our narrator to help with is to carry the body down into the basement. In many of Poe's stories, the basement has two functions. It's almost always the family crypt plus one other function. In this case, it's the armory. In the Cask of Amontillado, it's also the wine cellar. But here they bring down the body. This is why the narrator's been brought out to help with this process. Usher can't do it by himself, and then to put her into the coffin. So to set up the scene, they bring the body down into the basement crypt. And even at this point, our narrator never asks why Usher might have an extra coffin lying around. It's as though he says, "Hey, Usher, what good planning? The extra coffin just in case, someone dies. Like you were at Costco and you bought the coffin 2-pack, but you only needed one, so you put the other one down here." No, even here, with the extra coffin, which would be a clear sign of vampirism, our narrator never asks about this, so we don't have any other information other than what is offered in the story. He partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between brother and sister now first arrested my attention. And Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Let me pause here for a second. So is this the boon companion of his youth? Well, no, of course not. If this was the boon companion of his youth, our narrator would know that Roderick and Madeline were twins. Think about your own childhood. Back in elementary school, if your best friend had a twin, you'd know about it, right? So here our narrator only understands that they are brother and sister and doesn't know the deeper connection between the two of them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. And here, what do these details tell us as readers? Well, there's a pink hue to her cheeks and to the upper part of her chest, and so this means that blood still moves through her body. These are the details that confirm that she's not dead. Roderick knows this, but our narrator, who trusts everything, believes the cover story. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. Okay, if you've ever been to a funeral, at what point do they bring out the power tools to screw down the lid of the coffin? That never happens. The person inside is dead, so why are they using wood screws here to keep the coffin lid down? Well, that's because Usher doesn't want whatever is in the coffin to get out. And so his sister is in there, and he's trapped her there with wood screws. And if that's not enough, they secure a door of iron. And once this happens, Usher, over the next couple of days, begins to lose it, because he knows that down in the basement of his house, his sister is slowly, through the process of dehydration, dying, and he is going to allow it to happen. So at this point, let's consider how the elements of the story, if it is a vampire story, fit together so that there's a unified narrative going on inside of the Usher house. So at this point, let's consider how the elements of this story, if it were a vampire story, might fit together. Well, there are at least two ways here to arrange the story as a vampire tale to account for Usher and Madeline's actions. To do this, let me add one more thing. Today, I know from watching some recent movies and TV series that vampires have evolved a lot since the 1830s. For example, from True Blood, I know that now a person only needs to be bitten once and then after one night transforms into a vampire. Clearly, vampirism has come a long way in the last 2 centuries. As with many things like minute rice and microwave popcorn, the process that used to take more time can now be done quickly. But in the 1830s, according to the lore of that period, a human needed to be bitten multiple times by a vampire over a stretch of days before he or she turned into a vampire. So in answering the question, why is Roderick killing his tenderly beloved sister, we first need to answer, well, who is the vampire? Also remember that this story tells us that these two people who are in, quote, the maturity of their youth, I think that would make them around 25 years old, haven't ventured out of the mansion in years. So they only have each other, plus at least one servant and a doctor who occasionally drops by. And also, vampires, by nature, of course, need to feed. So if Roderick is our vampire, why then is he killing his tenderly beloved sister? Well, maybe he's been feeding on her and then slowly turning her into one of the undead. She's sleeping a lot. She wanders around the mansion during the day in a daze. She's wasting away in some sort of transformation, possibly. The doctor has no idea what's wrong with her, and she wears this white nightgown, which is, again, for women, stock vampire costuming from a lot of old movies and stories. In this interpretation, Madeline then might be in the process of transformation. So Roderick is killing her to save her from the prospect of losing her soul because he's unable to stop himself from feeding on her. Or maybe that's not it at all. Maybe Madeline is our vampire and she's been feeding on him. And now that Roderick is showing signs of this terrible transformation, he's killing her to save himself. Both of these interpretations account for many details in the story. 1, Roderick's knowledge that he's attempting to kill his sister. 2, that Roderick is either saving her or saving himself from some terrible fate. 3, that because of this terrible fate, he can still be seen as having deep feelings for her. And lastly, 4, that both of them in some way seem to have changed or in the process of changing into some unusual creature. You can easily see families in the late 1930s sitting around a fire arguing over what is happening in the mansion, and is perhaps one of these two people a vampire, only our dumb narrator hasn't figured it out yet? And if one of these people is a vampire, our narrator is clearly in a lot of trouble once the vampire becomes hungry again. But again, Poe never interprets the story in any transparent way. He only assembles clues that point to different explanations as to what might be happening in the mansion, and the vampire story is the kid-friendly version of the tale. In that same situation where a family is sitting around the fire listening to the story being read aloud, it's possible that the adults there in the room are putting the clues together in such a way as to assemble a different set of troubles inside that mansion. They might assemble some of the elements in such a way as to arrive at a version of the story in which Roderick and Madeline are engaged in an incestuous relationship, which then is the real secret that Roderick is keeping. Let me go through that same section of the story to pull out some other elements that point to this interpretation. Here is an early passage in which Roderick is explaining very vaguely the troubles that are in his house. He entered at some length into what he considered to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. Now again, from my experience watching TV, even in True Blood, vampirism is not a congenital condition. Each vampire must contract vampirism individually. So this idea that the problem is a family evil doesn't sound like a vampire story, but maybe the phrase family evil is being used in such a way as to suggest an evil that can exist only in a family, such as an incestuous relationship. Here's the next passage. This, again, is Roderick speaking. "I shall perish," said he. "I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise, shall I be lost." The definition of folly implies volition. You participate in folly. If a vampire attacks you at night, this is a tragedy. It's not a folly. An ongoing incestuous relationship in which you knowingly participate over a long period of time sounds far more like folly, in which Roderick might be eventually lost. Our next passage. "He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth." Roderick and Madeline are at the end of their youth, and they're living somewhat like husband and wife together in the mansion, which at least creates an image of that possible incestuous relationship. The next passage, which again is about Roderick. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severely and long-continued illness, indeed to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years. And here, too, the explanation of a natural origin for these problems certainly doesn't sound like vampirism. Vampirism would be a supernatural event, one that is outside of nature. One last element from the story. "There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage." This passage, of course, could apply to either interpretation that we've talked about for the story, but it seems to have the strongest human relevancy to the incest story. Again, the incest narrative is a story suggested by the details, but then assembled by observant readers. At that fireside reading in 1839, you can almost hear the adults whispering, "Is this a vampire story, or is Poe actually suggesting that Roderick and Madeline are involved with each other?" In this version of the story, Madeline's cataleptical wasting away is not tied to vampirism. She's not sleeping through the day to avoid sunlight. She's wasting away because she has a deep sense of guilt. She's probably not eating. She finds sleep as a type of retreat or escape more comforting than consciously confronting the relationship she's allowed to develop with her brother. In this version of the story, Roderick is killing her as a way of ending the relationship between them. And after we get to the coffin scene, the events that follow play out in similar ways. Roderick begins to go mad because he knows that he is allowing his tenderly beloved sister to die in the crypt beneath the house. Our narrator, clueless as ever, puts this down to hypochondria. That is, he thinks it's all in Usher's head. To calm him down, he reads a story about the knights of King Arthur, about Ethelred and the dragon. This is a story about a person by himself fighting to conquer a being or situation that frightens him, and that's kind of what The Fall of the House of Usher is about as well. As the dragon story reaches its climax, the strange sounds that Usher has claimed to have heard in the house for days are now heard by the narrator as well. And at this point, we move into the conclusion. The conclusion has, essentially, special effects or otherworldly events. If you've been reading the vampire story, it won't surprise you to find a whirlwind and light show at the close. But if you've assembled the explanation of incest, the story now asks you to believe that the evil in the house was of such potency that the earth is responding to it as well. As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant ponderous and ebony jaws. Let me pause there for a second. In these last two paragraphs of the story, what's happening at this point? Well, our narrator is noticing that Roderick is pointing to a wall across the room, and as he does so, the wall opens kind of like a jaw with ragged teeth made of wood, and there inside of it is going to be his sister. It was the work of the rushing gust, but then without those doors there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes and evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. And let's pause here for a second as well, because Poe is really a master of how this story is being assembled. Poe is using details without interpretation that he offers to the reader so the reader can place on them the meaning that they've assembled into the story. And so if you've been reading the vampire story, this image will make perfect sense to you. All it says is that there was blood upon her white robes. If you have the vampire interpretation in your head already, well, a white robe is stock costuming for female vampires, and that there's blood on a vampire's clothes would make perfect sense. But if you've been reading the incest story, you would give different meaning to the same set of details. Again, all it says was, there was blood upon her white robes. Well, what is that other rather famous dress that women wear that is white? Well, it's the wedding gown. And what about the blood that's on it? Well, this wedding gown has been spoiled by blood, or by extension, perhaps, by a blood relation. So these details, which aren't interpreted in the text, can be interpreted in the reader's mind to provide meaning that then begins to close down the interpretation that an individual reader has constructed through the whole story. There was blood upon her white robes and evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse, a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. Let me pause here for a second. So if you're reading the vampire story, Madeline's come back and she is pissed off, and she is going to attack Roderick and bring him down, fangs out, game over. But the language says none of that. The language is very neutral in terms of how it describes the scene. We, as readers, if we have that vampire interpretation, are bringing that interpretation to this language and imputing our meaning to it. However, if you've been reading the incest story, this isn't an attack at all. This is the final terrible embrace of two people in forbidden love, and that love then is going to be the thing that finally kills them. But regardless of whichever version of this story that you've constructed for yourself, at this point the narrative is going to move into a sequence that has special effects that's going to close down the story at last. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there was a shot along the path, a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure of which I have before spoken, as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. And at this point, the story is over. The house and, presumably, I'm guessing, the island have sunk down into the tarn. The earth, because of the evil there, has reclaimed the mansion, and the water has purified the surface. At this point, the narrator simply turns away, I guess, without meaningful comment, as if to say, I wonder what all that was about. But in all this, we can see Poe's craft. Not only is he repurposing the tools of poetry to create mood and engage emotion in fiction, he's allowing readers to help construct the ultimate meaning of the story. In this lecture, I've laid out a couple of possible interpretations as to what might have been happening in Usher's mansion. But these are not the only interpretations that critics over decades have put together. In this, Poe is beginning to explore ways that fiction can engage readers through the process of narrative exploration that far exceeds what other fiction writers of this period, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne and Washington Irving, were attempting to accomplish in their stories.